Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one, though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Plus, you could open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for 99 cards since we're excluding that commander cost. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today, though, make sure you go check out our new Golden Pig playmat on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's bought one so far, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you stay up to date on the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Atraxa, Praetors Voice. Atraxa is a 4/4 angel horror that costs green, white, blue, black. It has Flying Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, Proliferate. Atraxa is an incredibly powerful commander, and she can be built in a variety of ways. Her ability to proliferate at the beginning of your end step is a very unique ability to build around. Since we're building within a budget, we are slightly limited on what kind of builds that we can do. The most effective way that I found within our budget is to build a +1/+1 counters build. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we want to build up our army and then add more and more counters. So not only does Atraxa proliferate at the end of our turn to add more counters, but we've also got plenty of other ways to get +1/+1 counters on our creatures. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we can either overwhelm our opponents with our giant army, or we can sneak through their defenses. Even our smallest creatures can become huge threats with this deck. So if our opponents don't stop us early, it's very easy for this deck to spiral out of control. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's start off with tactic number 1, Grow Forth. With a 4-color deck, it's important not only for us to ramp, but also to fix our mana. So we're going to be running things like Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Ramp and Growth can do the exact same thing, but it's a sorcery. Next up is Farseek, which will let us search our library for a plains, island, or swamp and put into play tapped. And then we're running a couple of cards that will get us 2 lands. Cultivate will let us put one of those lands into play tapped and the other into our hand. And then Harrow will let us put 2 lands into play untapped, but we do have to sacrifice a land to cast it. Next up is Diligent Farmhand, which we can pay 1 into green to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Dawn Trader Elk does the exact same thing, but we only have to pay a green to do so. And then there's Fertility, which is a perfect fit for this deck. It enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And then at any time we can pay 1 into green to remove a +1/+1 counter from it to make target players search their library for a basic land and put into play tapped. So even with just Atraxa's ability to proliferate, we're going to get an extra counter on Fertility at the beginning of our end step. And then there's Elvish Rejuvenator, which will get a land from the top 5 cards of our library and put into play tapped. And then there's Farhaven Elf, which will search our entire library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up is Rishkar Pima Renegade, which when it enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. On top of that, each creature that we control with a counter on it has tap to add green to our mana pool. This card is especially effective in this deck because it's going to make pretty much every single one of our creatures tap for mana. And finally, we're running a couple of mana rocks that really benefit from Atraxa's proliferating. First up, there's Everflowing Chalice, which gets a charge counter for every 2 mana that we put into it. And then we can tap it for a colorless mana for each charge counter on it. The reason that it's so effective in this deck is that we can proliferate with Atraxa. This means that each turn it's going to get 1 more charge counter on it. And then Astral Cornucopia is similar, but it's going to get a charge counter for every 3 mana that we put into it. And on top of that, it can tap for any color. Finally, there's Pyramid of the Pantheon, which starts off as an inefficient way to filter mana, but then it becomes a huge mana source later. We can pay 2 to tap it to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, and then we get a brick counter on it. Once it has 3 brick counters on it, we can tap to add 3 mana of any 1 color to our mana pool. But after we get that initial brick counter on it, we can use Atraxa's ability to proliferate to add another brick counter to it each turn. So it won't take long for us to actually benefit from this card. Alright, so we've talked about fixing and ramping, but let's get to the heart of the deck and start talking about some of those creatures with +1/+1 counters. So it's time to move on to tactic number 2, take this. First up, there's Servant of the Scale, which enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And then when it dies, we can move all of its +1/+1 counters onto another creature. While it may start off with only 1, again, this deck is very good at building up those +1/+1 counters. So much so that when it dies, it's going to be very effective for us still. And then we've got 2 creatures with Graft with Simic Initiate and Aquastrand Spider. So Simic Initiate has Graft 1, so it's going to enter the battlefield with 1 +1/+1 counter on it. And then whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we can move a +1/+1 counter from it onto that creature. And then Aquastrand Spider has Graft 2, so it gets 2 +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield. It also has Pay a Green, target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains reach until the end of the turn. Graft is very effective with this deck because again, we can proliferate with Atraxa's ability. So by proliferating, we can give these creatures more counters so that they can distribute them to our other creatures. So then we can grow the counters on those other creatures too. Another creature that's good at distributing counters is Scrounging Bandar. Scrounging Bandar is going to enter the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, we can move any number of +1/+1 counters from Scrounging Bandar onto another target creature. But we have a creature that does this in an even bigger way with Forgotten Ancient. Forgotten Ancient starts off as just a 0/3, but whenever a player casts a spell, we can put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then at the beginning of our upkeep, we can move any number of +1/+1 counters from it onto other creatures. This card gets out of control fast, especially in combination with other cards in this deck. And finally, there's Citadel Siege, which when it enters the battlefield, we can choose Khans or Dragons. The vast majority of the time, we're going to choose Khans because at the beginning of combat on our turn, we can put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control. But if we chose Dragons at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, we can tap target creature that they control. It's very important for this deck to get +1/+1 counters on all of our creatures so that we can build them up with our proliferating. But let's go through some creatures that might not need any help with counters. It's time to go into tactic number 3, Looming Threats. First up, there's Altered Ego, which can't be countered, and we can have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature, except it's going to enter the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So just by paying 5 mana, we can make a copy of any creature on the battlefield, and it will enter with a +1/+1 counter. This can not only be huge for us by copying one of our opponent's best creatures, but we can also copy one of our own like Forgotten Ancient. It can also be very powerful for us if we copy something like Sunscorched Regent. Sunscorched Regent may just start off as a 4/3 with flying, but whenever an opponent casts a spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it and we gain 1 life. Again, with multiple opponents, we're going to get a ton of +1/+1 counters on this creature very quickly. And finally, there's a creature that can grow even faster with Vulturous Zombie. It's a 3/3 with flying, but whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, we put a +1/+1 counter on Vulturous Zombie. So this triggers in a lot of different ways. Just to name a few, if an opponent casts a spell, discards a card, gets milled, or if something dies on their side, we're going to get a counter on it. This card gets out of control just on its own very quickly, but with this deck we can make it even bigger. But let's talk about some ways that we can spread our counters out to make everyone a threat. Let's go through some of those ways now in tactic number 4, Share the Wealth. First up, there's Collected Effort, which is going to let us choose 1 or more if we escalate it. We can destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, destroy target enchantment, or we can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. The vast majority of the time we're going to be choosing that last one, but it's nice to have some flexibility. And then there's Abzan Ascendancy, which when it enters the battlefield, we're going to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that we control. On top of that, whenever one of our non-token creatures dies, we get a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So not only can this help us grow our team in power, but it can also keep bodies on the battlefield. Next up is Venerated Loxodon, which has Convoke, so we can tap creatures to help cast it. And then when it enters the battlefield, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures that help convoke it. Then there's Ridgescale Tusker, which just straight up puts a +1/+1 counter on each other creature that we control. Next up is Loyal Guardian, which can provide us with a ton of value throughout the game. It has Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that you control. So with just this and Atraxa's ability to proliferate, we're going to get 2 counters on every single one of our creatures each one of our turns. Then there's Juniper Order Ranger, which will not only grow our other creatures, but it's going to grow itself. So whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we get a counter on that creature and a +1/+1 counter on Juniper Order Ranger. But there's a card that can grow our team even faster, and that's going to be the Golden Pig of our deck. The Golden Pig is the #1 card out of our 99. And the golden pick for this deck is Master Biomancer. Master Biomancer is a 2/4 elf wizard that costs 2 green-blue. It has each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power and as a mutant in addition to its other types. So just to start off, each creature is going to get 2 +1/+1 counters from Master Biomancer whenever they come into play. And with this deck, we can easily grow that number. Just by putting even a few +1/+1 counters on Master Biomancer makes this get out of control very quickly. Say for example we have something like Forgotten Ancient in play with 8 +1/+1 counters. If we take all those +1/+1 counters during our upkeep and put them on Master Biomancer, whenever we cast a creature, it's going to come into play with 10 +1/+1 counters on it. So even our smallest creature like Diligent Farmhand will be an 11/11 when it comes into play. And again, those counters are just going to keep growing and growing with this deck because Atraxa is going to proliferate them. This card can turn every single one of our creatures into a huge threat, and that's why it's the golden pig of the deck. But let's talk about some ways now that we can make them into even bigger threats. It's time to go into tactic number 5, Doubling Down. First up, there's Solidarity of Heroes, which will let us double the number of +1/+1 counters on a creature. And it also has Strive, so we can choose more than one creature if we pay its Strive cost. And then there's Winding Constrictor, which says if 1 or more counters will be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many of those counters +1 are placed on that permanent instead. And next up is Pure Imaginative Rascal, which says if 1 or more counters will be put on a permanent your team controls, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. Both of these cards really help us build up our counters quickly, because every single time we're going to get counters on a creature or an artifact, we get 1 extra one. But there's a card that does this even better and was very close to being the golden pick of the deck. And that card is Corpse-Jacked Menace, which says if one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So now instead of just getting an extra +1/+1 counter on one of our creatures, we get double the amount. With this deck, this gets out of control very quickly, and if our opponents don't deal with this, we're going to win the game very shortly. But there are even more ways to get more +1/+1 counters on our creatures. Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 6, I'm a giver. First up, there's Thrumming Bird, which is just a 1/1 with flying, but whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to proliferate. The vast majority of the times, at least one of our opponents won't be able to block this, so we'll get an extra proliferate each turn. But there's a card that does this in an even bigger way with Inexorable Tide. It's an enchantment that says whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. So now every single time we cast a spell, we get to add more and more counters to our permanents. Whether that's charge counters on our artifacts or +1/+1 counters on our creatures, the value of this effect is incredible. But in order to keep this engine going, we're going to have to draw some cards. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 7, counting cards. First up, there's Tezzeret's Gambit, which is going to let us draw 2 cards and then proliferate. So not only will this card help us grow our hand, but it's also going to help us grow our team. And then there's Enclave Cryptologist, which just starts off as a 0/1. But we can pay 1 and a blue to put a level counter on it, and then it can tap to draw a card and discard a card. And after we get that first level counter on it, we can just proliferate to get more on it. Once it has 3 level counters, we can tap to just draw a card, and we don't have to discard a card. Next up is Toothy, Imaginary Friend, which is partnered with Peer. So when it enters the battlefield, we can put Peer from our library into our hand. On top of that, whenever we draw a card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Toothy. And then whenever it leaves the battlefield, we get to draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. So Toothy provides us with a ton of value by getting Peer, and it's going to draw us a ton of cards, but it can also be a huge threat when it's on the battlefield. Speaking of value, there's Fathom Mage. Fathom Mage starts off as a 1/1, but it has evolved, so whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, if it has a greater power or toughness, we get a +1/+1 counter on Fathom Mage. And then whenever a +1/+1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, we get to draw a card. It is very easy for us to draw a ton of cards off of Fathom Mage with this deck. And next up is Bred for the Hunt, which is an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. This card just provides us with an incredible amount of value for a very low investment. Then there's Armorcraft Judge, which when it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card for each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Shamanic Revelation and Camaraderie can draw us even more cards because they're going to draw us a card for each creature that we control regardless if they have a +1/+1 counter on them. On top of that, Shamanic Revelation is Ferocious, so we're going to gain 4 life for each creature that we control with a power of 4 or greater. And Camaraderie is going to gain us 1 life for each creature we control and give all of our creatures +1/+1 until the end of the turn. And finally, there's Oracle's Vault, which has pay 2 to tap and exile the top card of your library. Until the end of the turn, you may play that card and then put a brick counter on Oracle's Vault. And then when Oracle's Vault has 3 or more brick counters on it, it becomes very powerful. It has tap, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of the turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. Again, once we get 1 brick counter on Oracle's Vault, we can just proliferate the rest. Now with this deck, it's very important to keep our creatures alive, especially Atraxa. Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 8, Shields Up. First up, there's Ring of Zathrid, which serves a double purpose in this deck. It's an equipment that has pay 2, regenerate equipped creature. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature if it's black. So by equipping this to Atraxa, not only can we save her by regenerating her, but we also get a counter on her each upkeep. Next up is Sporeback Troll, which has Graph 2 and pay 1 and a green, regenerate target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. With just a little bit of mana up, this is a great way to save key creatures. And then there's Plaxcaster Frogling, which has Graph 3 and pay 2, target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains Shroud until the end of the turn. And Shroud can definitely help us in some situations where regenerating can't. Next up is Together Forever, which when it enters the battlefield, we get to support 2, so we can put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. And then we can pay 1 to choose target creature with a counter on it, and when that creature dies this turn, we get to return it to its owner's hand. This is a very cheap way for us to not only get counters onto the battlefield, but also to save some of our creatures. And finally, there's Golgari Charm and Inspiring Call, both of which can save our entire team. Golgari Charm will let us choose 1. We can give all creatures -1/-1 until the end of the turn. We can destroy target enchantment, or we can regenerate each creature that we control. This card is very flexible, and we're generally going to be using this to either destroy an enchantment or to save our team. Inspiring Call is going to let us draw a card for each creature that we control with a +1/+1 counter on it, and it's going to give them indestructible until the end of the turn. This card can not only save us in certain situations, but it can also put us way ahead. So we've talked about some ways to make our strategy work, but what about some ways to disrupt our opponents? Let's go through those ways now in tactic number 9, take care of it. First up, there's Transmogrifying Wand, which enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters on it. We can pay 1 to tap it and remove a charge counter from it to destroy target creature. Its controller gets a 2/4 white Ox creature token in place of it. Now we can only activate this at sorcery speed, but still an incredible piece of removal for this deck. Because with Atraxa in play, we're never going to run out of charge counters on this. And then there's Reclamation Sage, which will destroy target artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield. But then there's Wickerbow Elder, which can be even more effective at removing artifacts and enchantments. It enters the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it, and then anytime we can pay a green to remove that counter to destroy target artifact or enchantment. With Atraxa's ability to proliferate, we can get more and more -1/-1 counters on it. But keep in mind though that if we put a +1/+1 counter on it, it's going to cancel out one of those -1/-1 counters. Next up is Negate, which will let us counter target non-creature spell. Generally we're going to have the biggest threats creature-wise, but it's still a good idea to have some spells that can counter them too. That's why we're running something like Arcane Denial, which can counter any spell. On top of that, at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, its controller is going to draw 2 cards, and we get to draw a card. But an even better counterspell for this deck is Fuel for the Cause. Fuel for the Cause says, counter target spell, then proliferate. So not only can this card disrupt our opponents, but it has incredible synergy with our deck. So now that we've talked about stopping our opponents, how do we actually defeat them? Let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 10, Active Finality. First up, there's Cultivator of Blades, which has Fabricate 2. So when it enters the battlefield, we can either put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, or put 2 servos into play. The vast majority of the time, we're going to choose to put those counters on it because of its next ability. It has, whenever it attacks, you may have other attacking creatures get +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is its power. So by continuing to grow Cultivator of Blades' power, we can make all of our creatures huge when they're attacking. And then there's Elite Scaleguard, which has, when it enters the battlefield, Bolster 2. But the main reason that's in this deck is whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, we get to tap target creature defending player controls. Another way to get our creatures through is with Abzan Falconer. Abzan Falconer has Outlast for a white, and also each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it has flying. But the best way to get our creatures through is with Herald of Secret Streams. It says creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. But these are all great ways to give our creatures some evasion and to help them get through. Another way to give them some evasion and even more abilities is Odric Lunarch Marshal. It says at the beginning of each combat, creatures you control gain first strike until the end of the turn if a creature you control has first strike. The same is true for Flying, Death Touch, Double Strike, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Skulk, Trample, and Vigilance. So basically with Odric and Atraxa in play, each of our creatures is going to get Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink. This is an incredible effect and turns our creatures into even bigger threats. But perhaps the best way to make our creatures into huge threats is with Overwhelming Stampede. Overwhelming Stampede is a sorcery that says, until the end of the turn, creatures you control gain Trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. It's very easy for this deck to grow the power of our creatures, so it's not unheard of for us to have a 10/10 on the board. And then when we cast Overwhelming Stampede, all of our creatures are going to get +10/+10 and Trample until the end of the turn. This is a great finisher that can let us finish off all of our opponents all at once most of the time. This deck is a ton of fun and is very powerful. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 36 lands in this deck, including Guildmage's Forum and Opal Palace. Guildmage's Forum taps for a colorless, and we can pay 1 to tap it to add 1 mana of any color. If that mana is spent on a multicolored creature, it enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And then Opal Palace also taps for a colorless, but we can pay 1 to tap to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity to our mana pool. If we spent that mana to cast our commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone in this game. And then we're running Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up is Grasslands, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for a forest or plains and put it onto the battlefield. Then we're running all 5 Panoramas, which we can tap for a colorless. We can also pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search for a basic land. Bant and Esper Panorama can search for 3 of our basic lands, whereas Naya, Jund, and Grixis Panorama can only search for 2 of them. Then there's Warp Landscape and Terminal Moraine, both of which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice them to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we're running 4 of the Vivid lands with Vivid Grove, Creek, Meadow, and Marsh. Each of them enter the battlefield tapped with 2 charge counters on them. They can each tap for 1 color, or we can tap to remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Finally, we're going to be running 20 basic lands. 10 of those will be a forest, 4 will be islands, 4 will be plains, and 2 will be swamps. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Atraxa EDHREC deck is going to set you back $339.44. Let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, costing us exactly $25. A quick reminder that the Commander's cost was excluded for both of these decks. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, there's Gave Guru of Spores, which comes in at $1.22. It's a 0/0 Fungus Shaman that costs 2 white, black, green. It enters the battlefield with 5 +1/+1 counters on it, and you can pay 1 to remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature you control to create a 1/1 green sapling creature token. You can also pay 1 to sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Gave is just a fantastic way of helping us build up our board and distribute +1/+1 counters. Then there's Champion of Lambholt, which comes in at $1.86. It's a 1/1 human warrior that costs 1 green. It says creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt's power can't block creatures you control. When another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lambholt. So Champion of Lambholt can become a huge threat on its own, and then also it's going to help our team get through. Then there's Cathar's Crusade, which comes in at $2.52. It's an enchantment that costs 3 white, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This card can help our deck get out of control very quickly, because the more creatures we cast, the more counters we're going to get. Then there's Hardened Scales, which comes in at $4.01. It's an enchantment that costs a green, and it says if one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on it instead. This is just another great effect for +1/+1 counters like Whining Constrictor and Pier. Next up is Colonian Hydra, which comes in at $4.40. It's a 0/0 Trampler that costs 3 green. It enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever it attacks, we get to double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature that we control. With just one swing with Colonian Hydra, it's usually enough to put us way ahead of our opponents. Finally, there's Deep Glow Skate, which comes in at $6.40. It's a 3/3 fish that costs 4 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, we get to double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents. This effect is like proliferating, but it's even better because it's doubling instead of just adding 1. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Because not only will you get great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure you follow us on social media so that you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck tags. There's even a general tier where you get your own personalized deck tag dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tag, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And make sure you check out our other deck techs, Commander Excluded episodes, and Super Budget episodes too. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.